billions of human beings actually live on our wondrous earth. Infinity has given every one of them a very powerful tool, a tool that in almost all cases has been undervalued, or in the worst hypothesis, not understood at all, a tool that allowed and allows human beings to create, more or less consciously, everything they desire. The mind. A very powerful tool, so powerful to require attention and consciousness in its use. Because as it can be used to create beautiful and harmony masterpieces, it can be used to create disharmony and suffering monsters as well. The mind of human beings, our mind, is an extraordinary powerful tool, but very simple in its base functioning. Nevertheless, its enormous power, added to the simplicity of its management and unconsciousness of its potential, can give form and even feed something that is not in our plans. Something that instead of sustaining, steals us energy. Something that in this very moment has under its control the greater part of the human beings living on the planet. The apparently normal state of the mind of human beings' majority, at the end of their education process transmitted by their predecessors, intended as a snapshot of its activity in any given moment, is this.
Ey, die Würstchen sind fertig. Würstchen. Oh Gott. Würstchen.
Dreh die zwei da noch mal.
Warte nicht.
Ich glaube, das war
meine.
Practically every one of us, in any of our differences concerning countries, gender, age, culture, is sharing this characteristic. Everyone. Its intensity can vary depending on some cultural factor as the education received or the ethical values of the society in which we are born. In fact, there are some cultures and societies that do not develop these characteristics automatically. Furthermore, it can be more or less accentuated based on personal characteristics. But after a certain moment, typically in the first childhood, the so-called human being normal mental activity becomes this.
Ey, die Würstchen sind fertig. Würstchen. Oh Gott. Würstchen.
Dreh die zwei da noch mal.
Warte nicht.
Ich glaube, das war
meine.
This is the so-called normal state of the human being's mind, because shared between billions of people, thus considered normal. Is it possible to think lucidly in the middle of this chaos? Is it possible being able to see things with attention and clearness if inside we are in this mental state? Would you be able to listen with attention to something or someone if in the external reality you were in a place with a constant environmental noise like that?
Ey, die Würstchen sind fertig.
Isn't strange this confusion is fluttering in the mind of almost all human beings on this earth? Here is the first footprint on the shores of consciousness of something elusive and evasive, which acts indiscriminately on every human being in the same way. Mess. Inability to concentrate. Inconstancy. Normal? Of course there is another side to the coin. There are human beings on this wondrous earth whose natural state of the mind is this. A huge space in which they perceive and celebrate in peace and joy everything that is, which allows them to think clearly, see clearly, listen carefully, and then create wonderful creations of beauty and vibrant harmony. This happens because they have defeated something in them that did not allow them to be who they really are. How have they achieved this result? Why they wanted it? What prevented them from reaching it? The second elusive footprint on the shores of consciousness is a simple assessment. Can you stop at your wish this incessant and useless mental activity that is constantly populating your mind?
Ey, die Würstchen sind fertig. Chrissy! Oh Gott.
You are not able to stop this unnecessary meal of the mind, if not for 2 or 3 seconds, without discreet effort. Naturally, you might think it is a normal fact, and the funny thing is that you think it really. The mind that articulates thoughts through one of its thoughts is thinking that it cannot be interrupted in its useless meal, and how could it be otherwise? Can the mind think about not thinking? However, this simple test puts you in front of a series of indisputable facts. First, your mind is not under your control, because if it were, you would be able to stop the useless mental activity whenever you want and for as long as you want, not for just 2 or 3 seconds. Second, you try to interrupt your mental activity without success. Therefore, it follows that something within you tried to stop the mental activity as well inside you, managing it for a while. So, this something has been able to observe and drive a phenomenon that is beyond the thinking mind. And if it's so, this something in you is not your mind that articulates thoughts. Or better, this something in you is not the mind that articulates confused, unnecessary, unstoppable thoughts. But if there is something in you that is not the mind that thinks this kind of thoughts, then who are you? And why your thinking mind is out of control? If your thinking mind is out of control and you are not this mind, where are your actions originating from? Within human beings act 2 types of mind. Actually, mind is a word that does not perfectly fit the definition of the human mechanism acting internally to evaluate and render reality. However, in this context, we will use it for convenience. In terms of depth, the first of these 2 minds is the first you meet, more evident and manifest, using the internal dialogue as an element of self-affirmation and self-perpetuating. From now on, we will call this mind the surface mind. Its features are simple. The surface mind constantly dialogues with itself, is totally focused on the past and future, rationalizing everything in terms of profit and loss from what it can understand about reality, and makes decisions based exclusively on the past experiences. It changes its ideas and direction every few minutes. It projects anything that can be projected and computes anything that can be computed. It is unable to concentrate, and its natural state is this.
Ey, die Würstchen sind fertig. Chrissy! Würstchen!
Nee, die 2 da.
Below the surface mind, there is a more silent mind, which perceives reality without interpretation of thoughts. It knows what is the best way for us and lets us know through sensations and feelings. Since this mind doesn't operate through thoughts, but through an energetic assessment of the here and now, it shows us a way without relying on any calculation of profit or loss, and no expectation for a certain result. This mind has no need to make plans or projects to set future deadlines, because it doesn't use the future as an escape way, and doesn't take decisions based solely on data from the past, because it doesn't use the past as an immutable model for the present. From now on, we will call this mind the deep mind. The two ways in which we interact with and interpret the reality are therefore the internal dialogue, related to the surface mind, and the sensations, the feeling, related to the deep mind. But beware, what we call sensation here does not refer to emotions, because sensation and emotion are two very different things. An emotion is usually a body's reaction to an experience or an image, or even an internal dialogue that the surface mind associates with the conditions that have caused it. This association ends quickly to mechanically trigger the same reaction of the body, the same emotion, whenever the same external conditions recurs. An imaginary example. One day, a person treats you unpleasantly, and the hat that the person wears is something that strikes you. From that moment on, in an unconscious way, the surface mind associates that particular hat with a rude behavior. So, every time you will meet someone with a similar hat, you will perceive an internal discomfort, an unpleasant emotion that will take you to step back or to be rude for no reason, even if the person wearing it is the most educated one you've ever met. This reaction is an emotion. The body has triggered an automatic, mechanical, associative emotion, ultimately totally unreal. The surface mind and emotions are strictly related. We will see later in detail what this means, because the mechanism inner dialogue emotion is a key element that must be understood as best as possible. A feeling is something rather vague, like a delicate and subtle interior background that constantly communicates information about how to better interact with the energy, and therefore the reality, which surrounds us. This undefinable background is almost suffocated by the surface mind, but in the course of time it can become powerful and clear if we allow it to act without resistance, and if we recognize in it our true inner voice that knows what is best for us and knows how to communicate it to us. It happened to every one of us to feel somehow divided between an interior impulse fed by a feeling or a sensation and directed to an experience and a series of rational thoughts that somehow attempts to dissuade us and inoculates in us doubts that takes away the enthusiasm. In almost all cases, even always, if we are unfamiliar with the expansion of the consciousness, the rational thought prevails on feeling, and the feeling or sentiment are rejected until they are completely off. Do we perceive an inner impulse to a new experience? Here it comes an inner dialogue of doubt, worry, fear. Here it comes emotions of fear and confusion caused by the same associative inner dialogue. Here it comes that the new experience is postponed or removed from the possibility of its manifestation, because no one likes to feel unpleasant emotions, and the fear, the worry, can be very unpleasant if we become these emotions. So, in general, we step back to make them disappear. This happens because the surface mind always tries to fight back or keep in silent the deep mind. And generally it succeeds in this intent because we give it our agreement as a field of consciousness, and because we do not know that we can observe emotions without becoming them. This is the reason why the surface mind keeps our inner field in constant confusion, to prevent us from listening to the faint whispers of the deep mind, a listening that could lead to the end of its unopposed control over us. And this is the reason why the behavior of the surface mind is another elusive footprint on the shores of the consciousness, a behavior that is actually one of the most powerful weapons in the arsenal that keeps us in a silent defeat, something that keeps us trapped in a cage that has no physical bars with invisible chains, something that looks normal only because billions of people are under its control, something that works in the shadows because the light of consciousness will reveal it, thus make it ineffective.
It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Something that from now on we will call lo sfidante, the opponent of our consciousness. What do we mean then by the word opponent? What is the opponent in our lives every day? By the word opponent, we propose to indicate a set of forces acting within the field of human consciousness, which have the aim of disempowering and keeping it in an unconscious state, identified with imaginary mental constructions. These set of forces act upon us as a conservative element, as an opposite and contrary force to our drive for evolution and expansion of consciousness. The action of contrasting by the opponent is, among other things, to prevent us from achieving his existence and then transcend and transform it into a light force. Really recognizing the work of the opponent in our lives, exposing his work and transcending it, is a task that can be difficult, hard, leading to doubts and suffering, which ultimately is his attempt to stay alive. It's a task that can be painful, because we all begin from the same point. We believe to be it. However, to recognize and bring to light our opponent is one of the most important tasks that a human being is called upon to undertake, because the opponent is the guardian of the threshold, the thought to cross to enter the boundless lands that rightfully belong to us as magical human beings in a wonderful universe. One of the main purposes of the opponent, as the word indicates, is just to challenge us, to test our ability, our will to continue on the path that leads to expansion of consciousness without ever give up. It challenges us in order to test and thus liberate our intention to journey towards those majestic realizations that we can achieve, that are part of our heritage of magical and wonderful human beings. This concept of an opposing force that challenges our drive to consciousness may seem apparently bizarre, if not on the limits of credibility. Yet, this concept is well argued, described and studied in great detail in many traditions of inner research around the world. For example, in one of the sacred books of the Jewish esoteric tradition, the Torah, and in the wisdom teachings of the Kabbalah, there are complex descriptions of the purpose and weapons at disposal of an energetic entity, whose name has become synonymous with the forces of evil in the Catholic Church. Satan. Satan, whose meaning is no more than the opponent, is the energetic entity that, just as an adversary, challenges us to reach the light. Its main purpose, according to Jewish tradition, is precisely to create the opposite force to that which drives us to the light, to allow the release of the force of change, because without resistance, there wouldn't be space for even the striving for consciousness and the search of the light. This concept may be deep, but it goes far beyond the scope of this document. What is important to highlight here is the role that the opponent for excellence in Jewish tradition, Satan, holds in the expansion of consciousness. Satan, an energetic entity trying in every way to hinder us in our journey towards the light of consciousness. As we all know, Satan is also known as the devil, il diavolo in Italian language. But few know that the word diavolo comes from the Latin diabolus and from the ancient Greek diabolos, meaning the one who divides. Divides what? What makes no sense in dividing. What can be controlled, only if divided. However, the traditions of inner research around the world seem to recognize other goals in the opponent, more pragmatic, in addition to the purely abstract goal that we have just indicated. One of our responsibilities as human beings is to understand and carry out with our eyes and our consciousness what all of these teachings is real, and what is only an allegory of a larger meaning. But it's good to know how the apprentices on the path of consciousness of various traditions are warned from the first, real, true confrontation that every one of them must support, the one with the illusory projection of themselves, the one with the opponent. Don Miguel Ruiz is a shaman of the Mesoamerican Toltec tradition. Born and raised in a family of healers in rural Mexico by a curandera, healer mother, and a nagual, shaman grandfather, conducts and disseminates worldwide the esoteric Toltec knowledge of his lineage. Don Miguel indicates the opponent with the name of a parasite. This is how, through his words, he describes his making and his purpose in the field of human consciousness. In the mind, we create the judge, a part of us that always judges everything we do or not do, all the emotions we feel or not feel. Normally, the judge finds us guilty, and we think of having to punish. The part of the mind that receives the judgment and feels the need of punishment is the victim. The victim is that part of us that says, "Poor me, I'm not too good, strong, not intelligent enough. What shall I do? How can I even try?" The judge and the victim build their existence on our system of beliefs, what we believe and what we do not believe. A system that has been instilled in our minds since childhood, when we believed in everything that the adults said. The Toltecs call this mechanism judge-victim system of beliefs with the name of parasite. The human mind is unhealthy because of a parasite that steals it the joy and the life energy. The parasite is transmitted like a virus from grandparents to parents to get to us, that we in turn pass it to our children, and its food are the negative emotions that come from fear. The parasite is a being made up of emotional energy, and it is a living being. It survives negative emotions and feeds on suffering. The parasite, an energetic entity that lives and feeds at the expense of another without giving anything in return. Carlos Castaneda is an anthropologist who has been immersed in another Toltec lineage of esoteric knowledge, that of Don Juan Matus. Don Juan Matus was the shaman leader, that is the nagual, of a Toltec lineage similar to that of Don Miguel Ruiz, probably originated from the same source, but now divided from it by many characteristics, such as the emphasis on the way of the warrior as a path towards personal fulfillment. Carlos Castaneda has in fact transcribed and published in his books many of the teachings he received from Don Juan. Near to the end of his existence, he decided to write something that also concerns the opponent very, very closely. That's what he said in a summary of his own words. The shamans of ancient Mexico discovered something transcendental. They discovered that we have a companion who remains with us throughout life, a predator that emerges from the depth of the universe and takes the domain of our lives, and we are its prisoners. If we complain, it stifles our protests. If we try to act independently, it does not allow it. The predator has taken the upper hands over us because we are his food, his source of livelihood. It was he, the predator, to instill our belief systems, the concept of good and evil, the social customs. It was he who set our hopes and expectations, as well as the dreams of success and the parameters of failure. He gave us greed, excessive desire, and cowardice. He made us creatures of habit, egocentric and prone to complacency. Using our egocentricity, the only conscious aspect left in us, the predator creates bursts of consciousness that then proceeds ruthlessly to consume. The predator gives us futile problems to force these flare-ups to emerge, and in this way makes us survive to continue eating the fiery energy of our pseudo-concern. The ancient shamans saw the predator. They call him the volador, the flyer, because it moves at lips into the air. Not a predicite. It's a black shadow of impenetrable darkness, jumping in the air, and then lands. The volador, an energetic entity that lives and feeds at the expense of another, without giving anything in return. Eckhart Tolle is a man of our time, born and raised in Europe, who has gone through an experience of sudden and total awakening. Indeed, in one moment, he made the maneuver that for many of us requires years of practice and discipline before it can be dealt with. He has completely disidentified himself from illusory projection of reality created by his surface mind, and has achieved the state of consciousness in him that is an expression of what he truly is. This process, which could be called an enlightenment, but could not be described through words, has allowed him, among other things, to return to observe the life without the numerous and unnecessary mental filters created by the surface mind. In this state of observation, he saw something very interesting, something that has much to do with the opponent, something of which we give a summary in his own words. The pain accumulated in your body is a negative energy field that occupies your body and mind. If you look at it as an invisible entity on its own right, you are getting quite close to the truth. It's the emotional pain body. Watch out for any sign of unhappiness in yourself, in whatever form. It may be the awakening pain body. This can take the form of irritation, impatience, a somber mood, a desire to hurt, anger, rage, depression, and need to have some drama in your relationship, and so on. The pain body wants to survive just like every other entity in existence, and it can only survive if it gets you to unconsciously identify with it. It can then rise up, take you over, become you, and live through you. It needs to get its food through you. It will feed on any experience that resonates with its own kind of energy, anything that creates further pain in whatever form. Anger, destructiveness, hatred, grief, emotional drama, violence, and even illness. Pain can only feed on pain. Once the pain body has taken you over, you want more pain, you become a victim or a perpetrator. Its survival depends on your unconscious identification with it, as well as on your unconscious fear of facing the pain that lives in you. The pain body, an energetic entity that lives and feeds at the expense of another without giving anything in return. Let's summarize then what the inner research traditions in the world, which we reported a small but significant sample, seem to suggest about the existence of the opponent. Within the field of human consciousness, there may arise, exist, prosper and operate an energetic entity that acts to deprive us of energy and thus keep us in a state of unconsciousness. Its goal is to continue to feed off a certain kind of our energy, and in the meantime prevent us to expand our consciousness, for not enabling us to become aware of its existence. Of course, to become aware of the existence of this entity and the way it works is the first and most important step to take. It will become a natural consequence then to immediately stop creating more food and sustenance for it. Stop feeding it. It will become less and less powerful until it is completely absorbed and transformed by our consciousness. When this transformation occurs, human beings cease to allow a voice in their head that talks to itself of unreal rubbish to be the sovereign of their existence, because they understand that that voice is not who they really are. When this transformation occurs, human beings cease to listen to a mind which obstructs, limits them, and bound them in every way possible instead of supporting and encouraging them, because they understand that that mind is not who they really are. When this transformation occurs, human beings become free. Whether it is therefore a parasite, a volador, a pain body, or the opponent, is an entirely irrelevant question, because it is not useful at all to know this on an intellectual level. What is really useful is to understand and see how it acts, what are the weapons it uses, what are the effects of its actions in our lives. To understand that we are in all likelihood its unwitting prey of energy. And above all, to understand that we, as beings of consciousness, are powerful and magical beings that have all the available tools to unmask it and transform it into our ally. It is about our happiness. It is about our well-being. It is about our peace. All states of being that are closer to us than the air we breathe and that are completely accessible to us. This is the reason why the opponent must be faced and transcended, not for who or what it is, but for how it reduces our existence. This is the only real challenge in our life before entering and living in the real world and being who we really are. However, the opponent will use every weapon at its disposal to oppose, because this is its nature and because this is the will of infinity. This is the reason why we need consciousness, clarity, and an unbending intent to face this challenge. This is the reason why in all the inner research traditions all over the world, those who accept this challenge are called warriors. Understanding who or what the opponent is, as we have seen, is a realization that one day will be revealed to us by the consciousness. Now, instead, we will focus on the consequences of its work, because the consequences of its work are the most obvious and visible trace of its work in the world. The trace that can't be erased, the effects of its disturbing actions. How does the action of the opponent manifest itself in our lives? Confused and continuous inner dialogue, made of a mass of voices, music, generally oriented toward negative and destructive thoughts, anxieties, and worries foremost unreal. Habit of judgment and quantification of all things, about everything, and especially about ourselves. The judgment usually is inadequacy, guilt, condemnation, contempt. Escape from intensity and intentional discipline aimed to constructive actions, with a constant shift towards an identified future, typically tomorrow, Monday, or the first day of the next month, of something that we could and should do now. An escape directed to leave us undisturbed in our indulgences. Tendency to the indulgent inertial drift toward habits that in almost all cases are constructed like perpetuation or escape from a state of suffering, and consequent emotional attachment to them. Self-sabotage of every inspiration that gives us joy and enthusiasm, with all sorts of unreal doubts and fears, generated by the inner dialogue and the surface mind, which lead us to the result of thinking rather than acting, as long as we have talked so much with ourselves to turn off the inspiration. Escape from the personal and total responsibility of our life through its systematic transfer outside of ourselves, with a consequent verdict of guilty. It is his or her fault. It is the fault of this situation. It is the fault of this structure. The overwhelming majority of human beings in modern Occidental society, spread by now all over the planet, shares with his fellow men all these aspects. Not just some, all of them. Naturally, what is the combined result, the effect of all these futures? Only one. Fear. We live in a continuous, unreal and self-induced state of fear. Fear of losing unreal, non-existent things, approval, reputation, the price for our supposed merits, and indulgences for our shortcomings, the safety. This is the most incredibly obvious trace, as far as covered, of the work of the opponent. We all have the same characteristics. Their effect is always misery, fear, and a discomfort that has no name. And this doesn't make us suspicious at all. The perfection of such a scenario, of such a strategy, is demonstrated by the fact that we can't become suspicious of sharing all the same aspects with others until we don't encounter someone who doesn't have them. And in the past 1,500 years, but we can probably go back to past 3,000 years, is exactly what happened. Human beings who set themselves free are existed and always will exist. Many of them have tried to share with their fellow human beings what they had discovered, but their message has often suffered such a filtering to become considerably altered or even almost subverted. And who was the architect? So, if the effects of the work of the opponent in our lives are fear, misery and suffering, Practically all of us, conscious or not, will agree that these effects are not positive for us and therefore should be changed. So why do humans accept them anyway, even though they will inevitably lead them to unhappiness and suffering? Why the message that has walked through all ages has never been heard by many, but instead has always been fought and obscured? Because usually humans do not remember that the models of unhappiness and suffering that they perpetuate and bear in their lives were literally undergone by them through a conditioning that begins at least since birth. Moreover, they aren't aware of the existence of different models, and even if they get the chance to know them, they won't probably trust in them. But the most important reason why we persist in misery, the masterpiece in the work of the opponent, comes from the way in which human beings interact with reality. Human beings filter all the reality through their inner mental and emotional field. By this filtering, they create an inner image of reality to which they suit to validate their perception. What did the opponent do then? It has intervened to manipulate to its advantage the part of our mind that we have unconsciously elected responsible for the interpretation of this inner image. The opponent has took the control of the surface mind. It's impossible to change until the surface mind governs our lives, because the surface mind is not an expression of who we really are, but the megaphone, so to speak, of the opponent. This is the reason why the inner dialogue is obsessively focused on our castration rather than our realization. This is the reason why whatever falls into our field of consciousness, unwittingly filtered by the surface mind, is discarded or not fed until its extinction, if only vaguely concerns the possibility of an inner awakening. This is the reason why all documents like this, books on inner research, an encounter with a conscious being, will always be kept farther off the possible, with doubts, criticism, and indifference by those who are not ready. The surface mind will filter their reality through an inner conditioned dialogue, and persons will dialogue with themselves, saying that are all nonsense, non-existent facts without any scientific basis, ridiculous rumors, and so on, until they will be agreed with themselves in their inner dialogue. In this way, the reality cannot but conform to their faith, because this is one of the laws of our wonderful universe. But then, how can you change? Whether they are aware or not, humans that don't have or cease to feed even just one of the above characteristics are already releasing the grip of their opponent. But before proceeding, it is time to unmask one of the most powerful weapons at its disposal to keep us under its control. It's time to unmask the way to filter the reality that the opponent makes us use to keep the command. What is the reality? Many of us, practically all, would answer by saying that reality is what we can see, touch, and experiment independently from the interacting human being. A chair is a chair for everyone, existing regardless of who is watching. This is as a human being generally conceives reality: unique, stable, accepted by everyone in the same way, external to himself, independent of his assessments, not influenceable, unless through an action involving sensory changes, and therefore perception, about the order or organization in which the constituting elements are assembling it. What may be experienced by anyone at any time and in the same way through the five senses is reality. Everything else does not exist. This is exactly the way in which the illusory prison of human beings is built and supported until it becomes a seemingly insurmountable prison. We shall not enter here into the merits of this claim, because a deepening of this topic would go well beyond the boundaries of this document. We will instead speak about the creation mechanism of the reality model shared by the vast majority of us, and how the opponent, with a masterpiece of strategy, uses it to his advantage. Our brain, but in general our whole body, is affected by a constant flow of information from outside, whatever that outside may be. According to our usual and shared model of reality, a model that we have learned and practiced for many years so insistent, it becomes an automatic process. Perception is filtered and processed in real time with our five senses in a magnificent and harmonious symphony, and the result is recomposed in our brain and interpreted by the surface mind to build the image of reality that then we use to interact with. The drawback is that it should not be the surface mind, but the deep mind having to make this interpretation, with the surface mind as an assistant, because one of the goals of the deep mind is just that: interpretation of the reality through a fluid and harmonious point of view with the energy that is reaching our field of consciousness. The surface mind is a wonderful gift. It aims to assist and support the deep mind, for example, by making available information related to past experiences in order to protect ourselves, or translating insights and thoughts from the realms of higher consciousness into verbal terms in precise projects, also including writing, arithmetic and math processing, which are tools available and congenial to it. Concepts that are expressed, for example, even in the teachings of Jewish Kabbalah. What happens instead? The surface mind puts itself between and performs a task not belonging to it and not able to do: the reality perception interpretation. How, therefore, is the reality assembled? Indeed, through the surface mind, but mainly through the tool routinely used by the surface mind when it's not in control: the inner conditional dialogue. As soon as the inner conditional dialogue, all at an astounding rate, interprets reality, is transforming it accordingly to a very simple scheme. If what is assembling is a repetition of a past experience, it searches in its database a similar experience, and when it is found, it is assigned to a corresponding label. A chair, oh yes, a chair, like that million chairs that I have already seen. A man wearing a hat, oh yes, a bad and rude man. If what is assembling is not a repetition of a past experience, there are two possible ways. if it is interpreted as a strong threat to the stability of the inner structures of interpretation and construction of the known, or if it exceeds the boundaries of what is deemed possible, is removed, suspended, or cancelled. If it is not interpreted as a threat or as something impossible, it's amended to make it suitable for a past similar model. A chair is not just a chair. Each chair is a miracle, a molecular dance of light, but a surface mind can never see it, because it simply is not suitable for this purpose. A chair becomes just a chair when the surface mind has interpreted and categorized it as being part of the chair's category, a known and non-threatening object, at least until someone makes the decision to throw it against us. But what has brought surface mind in a role that does not belong to it? We, of course, because we are always the ones deciding. Only we decided in a forced manner and without a fair and informed assessment. We have suffered this decision with the pressure in which we have been experiencing since our birth. The reality interpretation is made so by the surface mind through its inner dialogue, and it is here that the opponents come into action. Typically, the inner dialogue is continuously active and focused on idiotic groupings that remain always on, like a radio. I go to visit my aunt in Nebraska. Nebraska mountains. Beautiful snow in winter. By the way, I should organize the next ski holiday, because it's time. And now I have to buy new skis. Oh yes, that shop in the downtown. And so on, by idiocy through idiocy, our whole existence. This inconclusive flow, made by many voices, speaking each other's and even fighting amongst themselves, is indeed one of the main instruments of control of our consciousness used by the opponent. This inconclusive flow of inner words is the opponent's voice. That is to say, these many voices that seem to have their own life and that alternate in the domain of our interpretation of reality, this plethora of stimuli, voices, drives, preferences, aversions, are the opponent in its most manifested aspect. One moment, a voice urges us towards a direction. 5 seconds later, we change our mind. 10 seconds later, we see our friend and we are happy. 15 seconds later, we cannot wait to live. The interpretation of reality changes for no reason, just to follow the whims of a swarm of voices in the head. And instead of unifying ourselves even deeper into the inner core that really belongs to us, preserving and making it grow more and more powerful and authoritative, we continue to wander from interpretation to interpretation, believing to be happy or sad or free, just because a voice in the head tells us either happiness, sadness, freedom, and we believe it as puppets pulled by invisible strings. That's why we can say that the opponent has placed under its control the surface mind and uses it to his advantage. It overloads its operation and prevents his quietness, in a way that secures control of the unconscious human being whom is the victim, acting by the thousands of voices which is made. The surface mind is certainly not more powerful than the deep mind, because it would be like saying the right hand is more powerful than the left. Simply, we use the surface mind in a way that is inappropriate, and the deep mind is consequently suppressed by the mechanism of a noisy and uncontrolled overused surface mind. However, we have better to make a point clear. The opponent can do nothing in front of the consciousness. The opponent succeeds in its attempt to put under control the surface mind of a human being because the person does not know what is going on and therefore cannot prevent it. In practice, the opponent takes control of the surface mind typically in the early years of its existence, and with the time, the human being arrives quickly to believe what the surface mind tells him, then, essentially, believing to be the opponent itself. How is it possible, then, to get rid of something that is not even known to have? How can it be possible to get rid of something that one believed to be? A scenario that might be terrible to expose, having believed for years to be something that in reality we are not. And this awareness often coincides with the entrance in what many researchers call the night of the soul. Flashes of fear touch our inner field when the structures on which we had built the reality that we thought were so stable, untouchable and eternal, swaying menacingly under the pressure of truth. However, there is nothing, really nothing, to fear of. Realizing the tool by which we generally interpret reality, namely the surface mind, does not act under our conscious control, is undoubtedly useful, but there is more. There is another tool related to this way of interpreting the reality the opponent uses to perpetuate its presence in us. A tool that is essential to know, because it is also the instrument that, switched off, triggers and increases the opponent decay as a force of opposition and its transformation into an allied force. Many inner research traditions whisper us this is the main instrument on which the opponent is nourished by our energy, like a parasite. And if this is the main way in which it feeds, what then will happen turning it off? We speak about a very simple automatism created by the body, united with the mind which directs it. The vicious and self-sustaining cycle that triggers between the inner dialogue emotions. Emotions are a very important component in the response mechanism of the human energy field to stimuli and perceptions it receives from all that surrounds him. An emotion, as we all can witness and experience, produces immediate effects on our physical body and can change almost instantly our response behavior, which is adapting quickly to the most known and experienced way, able to bring into balance our whole energy system. But how an emotion is born? An emotion is basically an alteration in the body that occurs through the production and release of hormones and neurotransmitters into the various connection systems of our body. This change, this stimulation, is immediately captured by our perceptual mechanisms. Then it is interpreted as a response to a particular external situation that have caused in ourselves this reaction. For example, the perception of a tiger in freedom, without protective bars, a few meters away from us, will cause in the vast majority of us the release of a hormone well known to all, the adrenaline. And this release will cause the resulting interpretation of our perceptual mechanism that will associate this feeling with a precise pattern that is called fear. An emotion, then, is nothing but a sensation in the body that we perceive as a response to an event that has affected our field of consciousness. The alteration of the chemical equilibrium in our body produces an instantaneous sensation, and it is this sensation that we call an emotion, a shaking. What intervenes to give meaning, to interpret the emotion we are feeling? Of course, the models that have been included within the mind that we place in power of the interpretation of reality, that is, in most cases, the surface mind. If we do not give a name to what we are feeling, the emotion would be felt only as a sensation in the body, that born would have its peak and then decline to disappear fairly quickly. The key element, simple yet profoundly important in this scenario, is that the mechanism for creation of emotions is bidirectional. Emotions can also be created in the absence of a real external stimulus, focusing our imaginative capacity and consequently our attention on something that will be a catalyst. If you activate an internal image as a catalyst and maintain it long enough, the physical body will be flooded with emotions associated with it, as if this picture was really going on. If we listen to relaxing music and imagine to be comfortably lying down on a lawn, the physical body begins to produce hormones and neurotransmitters that are related to this scenario, even if we are sitting on an uncomfortable chair in an urban basement. Any one of us understands and knows with certainty that this mechanism works, because undoubtedly everyone practiced it many times in the course of their existence in various situations. And in this simple, automatic, normal human behavior engages one of the tactical masterpieces of the opponent to perpetuate itself and its control over us, in a way that perhaps you already begin to realize. As we have seen, the vast majority of humans use the surface mind as the element of interpretation of their perceptions in an inherited, automatic, and unconscious way. The control mechanism of the generation and interpretation of emotions is then run by the surface mind because it was unconsciously put at the helm of the interpretation of perceptions. The surface mind is generally under the control of the opponent. That is to say, it is focused on very specific thought patterns that we have already seen. These patterns of thought invariably produce emotions. Emotions that are saturating our beautiful planet Earth and all its inhabitants for millennia. Emotions that have the sole purpose of perpetuating the presence of the opponent in our field of consciousness. Emotions that are based on unrealistic assumptions that have no connection with our well-being and with what we really are. Emotions that are all related to a fundamental emotion, fear. How does the surface mind produce these emotions, which are the fuel of the opponent? Generating, through internal dialogue, conditioned thought patterns that are gradually loaded with emotion through this constant inner dialogue. This is the main weapon of attack and control of the opponent for the human field of consciousness. It is perhaps its only chance to get us through deception, to create something that is exclusively to its advantage. It gets us asleep through overfeeding and conditioned use of the surface mind in order to enter our field of consciousness and manipulate it for its own purposes by making us believe we are it. At the unconscious mercy of this mechanism, human beings do nothing but to perpetuate patterns of learned behavior that have no connection with what they really are. Feeding unreal patterns of thoughts unrelated to their very essence, human beings produce emotions that instead of supporting and making them happy, only feed and support the opponent and deprive them of energy and life force, constructive and positive. Following the surface mind, which is made of thousands of voices that are not theirs, human beings act in the world, living a life that is not theirs, acting as they really are not, at the mercy of the opponent, without having the slightest suspicion. The trigger and the involuntary self-reinforcement of the vicious circle inner dialogue emotion is thus the main weapon available to the opponent in its efforts to disempower our field of consciousness. Now, we descend further into the details of this process in order to become more aware of how we are skillfully manipulated. A process that we will call, from now on, the disempowering spiral. Everything starts with a thought that appears within our field of consciousness. Initially, this thought is essentially an image, a vivid flash, which is not accompanied by any words, because it comes from a place where words do not have any importance. It's a thought image that has enormous power, because it is the initiation of a creation. A thought that outlines a possible reality that we might choose to create or not, knowing that we have the possibility to choose. What we do, however, as the result of little or no knowledge of the phenomenon, is to comply instantly with it, like conditioned androids. Until we intervene to shine a light with our consciousness, these powerful thoughts images are generated involuntarily, unconsciously, and focused on repetition and the routine of experiences to which is generating, or has already triggered, a strong emotional attachment. These experiences will become habits, and habits will become emotional addiction, that is the primary support of the opponent, and one of the primary means of our energetic and vital disempowerment. So, we can say that until we intervene to shine a light with our consciousness, almost all of what we call free actions and creations are under the control of the opponent. It is simple to discover the evidence of an emotional addiction rooted into habits. If you try to put up resistance to it, or to suggest to another one the possibility that you can try to put up resistance to it, the reaction is always the same. Tension, nervousness, uncontrolled disagreement, up to an explosion of emotions of rage and resentment. This means that there is a strong emotional attachment hooked with the satisfaction of a habit. Therefore, the habit is controlled by the opponent. Really, almost all of our habits generate emotional attachments hooked with their gratification. So, we can say that almost all of our habits are under the control of the opponent. Once the opponent has generated in us a thought image to create a reality that is positive for it, it triggers the disempowering spiral. The surface mind intercepts these thoughts and starts to transform it into a reality through the conditioned inner dialogue, which will justify, encourage, support it, paying it all its attention. That is to say, it will be fixated on this thought, a behavior that is very easy to find in ourselves, but also in other human beings, and in locutions of common use, as become fixated or obsessed and similar. The focus of the surface mind, as we have seen, can produce a phenomenon of greatest importance, the generation of emotions corresponding to that focus. The continued and intense focus of the surface mind on the thought image triggered will sooner or later produce the generation of emotions, which in their turn will feed this focus with further energy, as if they were the confirmation and additional fuel to this focus. Thus, the process of disempowering spiral will load up the thought image with so much emotional energy to literally force the person who is experiencing it to act in order to manifest it. The circle closes. The thought image is manifested into reality. This is the simple, linear way in which the opponent manipulates us like puppets. This is the way in which, more or less consciously, we destroy our existence. But beware, this is also the simple, linear way in which we can build an extraordinary life. The only difference is the choice of the thought image to trigger. Either we choose it, or the opponent will. The consequent process is the same, but if the thought's image are our free and conscious visions, the disempowering spiral becomes the spiral of power. To make this process clearer, here is an example of how it works in a real-life situation that unfortunately many of us face daily. It's an example situation, like many others we could find and see at work in the lives of human beings. A situation that shows us, sometimes ruthlessly, an abstract underlying principle. Any human activity that is filled with emotional energy of attachment to its satisfaction is driven by the opponent to its exclusive advantage. The situation of life that we examine is that of drinking excessively. Here, we are immersed in our daily activities, relatively calm and without any worries. Suddenly, without warning and without reason, a thought image arises inside our field of consciousness. A thought image related to drinking an alcoholic beverage. The surface mind snaps and captures these thoughts, our conditioned inner dialogue, out of control, in which we trust, as if we were those voices, begins to repeat phrases like, "I have half a mind to have a quick drink. Yes, I would say I deserve just a quick drink. Well, it would take just a quick drink," agreeing with itself that yes, it's exactly as it is repeating to itself. This conditioned inner dialogue quickly generates an emotion, a sort of anticipation of the alcohol that we will drink and how good we will feel after this drink. From the standpoint of mere perception, this emotion is nothing but a widespread sensation in our body, like an itch, a current. But when the surface mind intercepts it, it is transformed into emotional energy for the use and sustenance of the opponent. An emotional energy, that is, a sensation to which has been assigned a label, that does nothing more than further feed our inner dialogue with our hypothetical need to have a drink. At some point, the emotional charge hooked to the thought image of drinking alcohol will be so great that we cannot help but pour us something to drink, reliving this emotional current and feeling ourselves relieved and in peace. But it will not pass a long time, and it will pass less and less time before this state of calm is disturbed again by a new emotional necessity generated from an unconscious thought image, and so on, in days, months, years of wasted energy in vain. Emotional addictions like this exist in enormous quantities without having the need to report them here. They can be very hard to overcome because the amount of emotional involvement in them is so great to deeply obscure the mind of their victims, especially once they're triggered. Moreover, the prolonged satisfaction of these addictions will inevitably alter also the balance of the physical body, which will progressively develop more receptors of the substances it receives into its circulation, to the detriment of others, which receives less or by no means, and instead should receive almost daily for its vitality and well-being. Thus, emotional addiction becomes physical too, and at that point can be really hard to get rid of it. In quiet moments, it seems to us to be able to cope with it without any problems. It appears like an illusory an evanescent ghost. When triggered, it becomes a demon who wants all our attention, all our energy, and then leaves us exhausted and drawn, only to return sometime later to ask for another tribute to our energy. A demon working for the opponent. But then, should we deprive ourselves of all so as not to fall into the trap of the opponent? Not on your life. The world is wonderful and full of experiences to live. What we should do is cut off or stop creating the emotional attachment to their satisfaction that we put in our actions, whatever they are. Deprived of emotional attachment to their satisfaction, the actions will not generate addictions, and the opponent will be cut off by the main, if not the sole, source of energy support that it uses to perpetuate itself against us, like a parasite. When an action is deprived of emotional attachment to its satisfaction, the experience is transcended. It is no longer important when, how, or why you do it. It can pass years before do it again, or a few minutes. You don't feel any void in its absence, nor you feel any need to do it again. If it's possible, you can do it. If it's not possible, simply you can't. There is no more yearning for its satisfaction. There is no more obsession, nor suffering for its lack. Yet, it is precisely at this point that you get the most enjoyment of the experience itself. It's only at this point that we can clearly determine whether the experience is really good for us or not. Without the emotional flow that had the sole purpose to give power to the opponent and disempower ourselves, we fully enjoy the experience every time that we will relive it again, just because we appreciate its impermanence, its quality, its real intake of energy, with serene and clear eyes. The state of mind which arises from the process of transcending an experience is one of the pillars of our integrity. To this state of mind, many traditions of inner research give the name of detachment. The ways in which the opponent intervenes in a field of human consciousness are two: attack and concealment. The attack is the active phase of the opponent. It is the time at which it triggers our inner demons, keeping us in chains. This is the phase it uses to energetically support itself, to feed, according to the Toltec tradition. The main weapon, the most obvious and probably the only one it owns, having proven effectiveness, is the use of the disempowering spiral, led up to the point where we generate a large amount of emotional energy of attachment to the thought image triggered. An emotional energy about an almost uncontrollable need, an addiction, in fact. You just need to take a quick look around to realize that virtually every human being surrounding you is handled through one or more emotional addictions, which they cannot and fail to do without. A manipulation which always originates in and is grown by the same strategy, the disempowering spiral. However, look at yourself. Maybe the look will be less rapid than what is necessary to find the speck in your fellow human being, but you may still find something that simulates an emotional addiction. Concealment is the passive phase of the opponent, in which it momentarily moves back and uses the advantage unconsciously acquired on us to keep us in a low energy state and out of balance, so as not being able to cope a later attack with energy and consciousness. How does it succeed in all this? Through overfeeding the surface mind with a useless tangle of thoughts that will produce low energy emotions and moods, such as anger, jealousy, envy, resentment, concern, and similar, all shades to the same emotion. Fear, which is ultimately the opponent's fear of being discovered. Thoughts that are facing automatically, changeable, erratic, contradictory, which trap us in a very simple way. They think themselves with the I pronoun. I think. I feel. To me, what he did is bad. Did you see what she did to me? Etc., etc. But who is this I? How many I are in your head? Is it possible that this I wants one thing and 5 minutes later wants another, sometimes very against the first one? It is not possible answering these questions without consciousness. But given that trying to answer to these questions, or just watching the ballet of the surface mind out of control, means starting to cut supplies to the opponent, the surface mind is overfed with chatter, music and noise to prevent the unfolding of consciousness. In the end, what happens in our lives, leaving the opponent continuing in its work of suggestion and control of the field of human consciousness? We won't follow our inspirations, that is, what makes us really feeling happy to exist, because the higher consciousness world's inspirations produce positive emotions, thus high energy emotions, which to the opponent are totally indigestible. We will oppose resistance to changes and will not accept those that cannot be avoided, because for the opponent, every change is a risk of being discovered. The opponent will create enough thoughts of resistance that will generate emotions of resistance. So, as well as doing everything possible to prevent the serene acceptance of change, we will support the opponent with low-energy emotions created by the futile resistance to what cannot be avoided. We will stand against something or someone outside ourselves and will fight it as the cause of our misery and our sickness, because we will attribute the responsibility of low-energy emotions living within us to external events or other people. But a simple and aware gaze is enough to realize that everything existing in our life was created and is being maintained only by us. And we are the only and sole responsible for that. We will become anxious and worried about losing what we have, and we will be more likely acting to defend rather than share. But whose anxiety and this concern of losing something is this? It is only the opponent's. As human beings, magical and wonderful as we are, all of us, we have nothing to lose, and we do not depend on anything, because we are everything. But it takes consciousness to find this out. A consciousness that the opponent cannot, nor should, allow the expansion of, for various reasons, perhaps even greater than itself. A consciousness that the opponent knows it cannot hold, because the consciousness-growing process is unstoppable and never-ending once awakened. We won't have equilibrium in the care of ourselves, but will remain emotionally attached to habits and situations that stop us instead of freeing us. Ramta, whichever this being will be, identifies with brightness these emotional attachments. Attachments to people, places, things, times, and events. Every emotional attachment to one of these spheres creates habits, and habits are actions that control a human being, not the contrary. We will live in our mind and its illusory creations rather than the reality of what happens in the present moment. Where is the totality of ourselves now? In the vast majority of cases, it's in the assumptions and presuppositions of the surface mind, even while we are acting. Thus, in one of the opponent's induced overfeeding aspects of surface mind. We will externally project our assumptions about reality when they are nothing more than thoughts generated by the opponent, and to them we will follow in the actions as if they were true. Isn't it like that in our life? Isn't it true that instead of asking directly, with humility, integrity and listening, instead observing quietly, silently, in awareness and acceptance, we ask ourselves questions we give ourselves answers, and then we believe that these answers are the reality. How many things have we destroyed in our life this way, then realizing it was all only in our surface mind? How many things have we destroyed in our lives, believing a mind manipulated by the opponent? We will separate more and more from other human beings and from life in its totality, for fear of suffering, to lose what we have, to not be able to defend ourselves from assaults by others. So we will create, or will become part, or we will end up in groups of us against them, built primarily for defense something unreal from something else equally unreal on the other side, something that death will sweep away as leaves on trees in autumn. There is no us against them. Aren't them perhaps human beings caught in the same illusion, manifested in another form? And if so, what is the difference between us and them? This is what the opponent is creating in our lives, if we give it leave to do so. Does it sound familiar? How much are we immersed in these things? How much are people around us immersed in these things? At the end, what the opponent is creating in our lives, if we give it leave to do so, can be summed up in one single word: suffering. The work of the opponent in our lives is now clear as its intended purposes. However, this is only the first step. An important step, of course, very important, because it is the beginning of the reconquest of our interior spaces. But it is still an intellectual step, meaning that it is not supported by an understanding of our entire whole. At present, we may be intellectually in agreement with what we saw and heard so far, or not. Or we could feel a current that emotionally shakes us and somehow makes us vibrate in harmony with this message. But both in one case and another, there is no difference. and the forces that we have given the name of the opponent will continue relentlessly to do their work until we will get into action, because the only difference is taking action. What does it mean to take action? It means to feel deeply within us the need and desire to break free from the mental and temporal world created by the opponent for its own use and consumption. It means being tired of creating suffering for ourselves and consequently for the world around us. It means recognizing that we are at the mercy of uncontrolled thoughts and emotional currents that push us back and forth like puppets. Without these premises, we will not take action, and not taking action, we will remain at the mercy of the opponent. There is no alternative to this rule. But when we decide to take action, then we should know how to act to reconquest ourselves. And it is just here that all the traditions of inner research, in some way rooted in truth, concentrate their attention. All, without no exception, give indications different in form, but equivalent in substance, to ensure the human being regains himself. This is one of the supreme wonders of our universe. Many, infinite ways for a single direction. We have the choice, not the selection. Infinite ways. Just one direction. Therefore, seeking to grasp the abstract metrics of the various ways that have the aim of creating the frame of mind of reconquest in a human being, we can isolate a path, a way that leads to understanding, then to consciousness, then to liberation. A path that leads us to have enough personal energy to settle in ourselves what we are gradually learning. A journey that teaches us to see and act for ourselves, following the currents of our connection with the infinite, which can never be lost, only blurred. This is not a path of successive stages that lead somewhere. We can say that this is a parallel path where each element is built and fed in parallel to others. The aim is to collect and release as much energy as to trigger the consciousness and restrict to the minimum the leaks of energy caused by the opponent. Consciousness means attention. Attention means energy. This path, this journey, this way, of course, is based on the observation of the work of the opponent in the lives of human beings, in our life, and then on the better way of action that limits to a minimum, up to completely stop, the related draining of energy. However, it's better to be clear. Apart from very rare exceptions, the path that leads to the liberation is not easy. It's not immediate. It's not short. It's not simple. Short periods of emotional connection with the higher worlds of consciousness are not indicators of a change, but only a concealment of the opponent in a time when our energy is high in some way. The true transformation is arriving to see what it really is. And once we have seen, asking ourselves whether to change or not becomes perfectly futile. Simply, we will act accordingly, and that's all. In any case, our goal, the goal of all human beings, is to live the best life they can live, in serenity and peace, in energy and strength, in understanding, integrity and compassion. Isn't it what we all want, in the end? Liberation can also be a meaningless thought, but living an intense, happy, strong and full life, which is a right of every human being, it is absolutely reasonable, and it is also the one to which the opponent stands out against. Then, even just to reach a state like this, it may be worth to act and live, consciously diffusing the targeted sabotages of the opponent to our totality. Now, let's see what weapons, nothing more than frames of mind and inner feelings, we have to fight and stop the work of the opponent in our lives. These weapons, these feelings, are exactly what we normally don't do, and this is the reason why they are so indigestible to the opponent. It is not able to stop their positive effects. Effects that are cumulative if our practices resist. Effects leading later to such an increase of energy and consciousness to give us the strength to finally engage in the one true confrontation that awaits us. The confrontation for excellence in front of us, which everyone, one day, will have to necessarily pass. The confrontation which we will call, from now on, the gate of the desert. The first weapon at our disposal, a very serious blow to the perpetuation of the opponent in our field of consciousness, although the most accessible in terms of mental understanding of its undeniable benefits, is itself already the factor that causes the surrender of 90–80% of presumed applicants for building a better life for themselves. Of course, it's the opponent who surrenders itself, and our consciousness that's identified in the yield, because the opponent knows how this weapon is harmful to it. But in fact, what happens is that humans avoid right from the beginning to wield this weapon, and in some cases they even come to rebel against it. And if human beings do not wield this weapon, they won't have access not even to the next, because the other weapons require a certain level of mastery of this inner state to liberate, in the course of time, their benefits exponentially. What are we talking about? The inner state of mind of discipline. Discipline is a dangerous word. Many people associate discipline, in fact, with a forced, bound regime, with an inner forcing, whereas discipline has nothing to do with this. By discipline, we mean a way of being and acting based on three basic elements. Deciding our actions consciously, acting without expectations, accepting any result in serenity. In general, human beings do the exact opposite. They decide their actions as a consequence of something. They act with all sorts of expectations towards themselves and other human beings. And given that the result of their actions is very, very often different from what they expected, that is, another expectation, they never welcome results in serenity, but with resentment, regret, and reluctance. Of course, each of these behaviors are an inheritance, induced in them by the domain of the opponent that's perpetuated for millennia. Discipline, understood as the union of these three basic elements, generates instead an energetic wave of positive emotions and enthusiasm, energy currents that are completely antithetic to those of which the opponent feeds. Moreover, the three elements are already in themselves individually antithetic to the general rules by which we live our lives, and this set of factors can determine, if discipline is maintained over time, the rooting of an inner state that prevents the opponent to easily access our energy. But the key of discipline and its tremendous added value lies in its permanence in time. A discipline is nothing but an illusion, if not maintained for as long as it needs to take root and unfold. Consciously deciding our actions means to evaluate the situation of life in which we are, and then decide one or more actions to be performed, taking into account the best possible energetic and functional efficiency available to us at that moment. That is to say, choose a direction that points straight to improve our living conditions, to an increase of our well-being and our vitality, to an inner and personal growth. In a chaotic life driven by the opponent, there's never time to stop and really think about our own existence. There's never time to consciously decide actions that bring us benefits and good fruits. We act, believing to make responsible and weighted choices, while we destroy our energy and our life with all sorts of harmful habits and emotional attachments, disguised as free decisions. We smoke 80 cigarettes a day. We eat well beyond our real needs. We constantly drink lots of damaging liquid. We treat our fellow human beings as objects. We work hours and hours just for an emotional addiction, without stopping a moment to wonder why. And we call this personal freedom. Acting without expectations means preventing the opponent to generate disempowering spirals based on an illusory judgment of the conditions around our action. Once an action is decided, it's necessary to act without considering in any way the opinions and assumptions created by the surface mind, because these opinions and assumptions are not ours. They are generated by the opponent for the sole purpose of triggering a disempowering spiral, and have no real basis. It's not easy, but just because we are not accustomed to our greatness. If only for one action we do our best, regardless of any expectation of gain or loss, approval or condemnation, applause or contempt, we will be surprised by the amount of wonderful things that we can create. Accepting in serenity any result means to realize something that has always been and always will be. The result of our actions is outside the domain of the decisions of a human being. The freedom of human beings is to act, that is, into the creative expression of the infinite in them. The results are determined by higher forces. Results that can come after a long time. Results that can be totally different from what we wanted. There are always results arising from our actions, but what, when, how much, and how is the domain and decision of the infinite. Accepting in serenity this truth, and therefore manifesting serenity in our life, is intolerable to the opponent, because serenity is one of our natural emanations as human beings, with which the opponent can't absolutely fit. The opponent will attempt to blur this emanation, triggering thoughts of negative judgment, of condemnation, of missed acceptance of the result of an action, for a very presumptuous non-compliance with its false expectations. But despite they are but thoughts, that is, subjective opinions and not necessarily true, and in addition, formulated and generated by a force in opposition to our field of consciousness, we might end up believing them, and this will trigger a new disempowering spiral, which will have the sole outcome to feed the forces of the opponent and to deprive us again of energy. Through the weapon of discipline, instead, inner force is able to support us in our journey towards the life we want and deserve to live, will be set in motion and fed, and the opponent will begin to lose energy because it will no longer be the one who decides disempowering actions instead of us. And its opinion and its false expectations will no longer receive our attention and our trust. Our awakened consciousness will no longer believe its thoughts of negative judgment or non-objective evaluation that it will try to introduce into our surface mind. All this will free energy more and more rapidly from the trap in which the opponent has caged it to its advantage, allowing us to progress with more and more effectiveness and speed towards the majestic life we deserve to live. But what is the difference between a disciplined action and a habit? Nothing but consciousness. A habit stems from unconscious thoughts out of control. A disciplined action, instead, springs from aware thoughts and decisions. Although both use the same resources at the disposal of human beings, a habit disperses energy for emotional addiction. A disciplined action increases it. But what really makes a difference is consciousness. If it is missing, the action becomes a habit. If it is powered, any action and any habit become a source of power. However, it's a good thing to be aware from the beginning of a very important element. The discipline is an illusion and will not give us any of its wonderful fruits if it's not maintained over time. For how long? Our deep mind knows it perfectly. The sensations it will release in us will tell us when the time of a discipline is over. While the discipline is beginning to take root in our inner life, and while we realize how we have always been deceived by our false expectations and our indulgent inertial drift, we can act to close other energy leaks in our field of consciousness. Actually, we can say that the closure of these leaks is still a containment, not a reassembly. However, this containment is very important for us because the progressive closing of our energy leaks implies freeing more and more energy to the benefit of our field of consciousness. Continuing in this methodical containment, we'll arrive having enough energy to attack frontally the most important and powerful causes of our disempowerment and our energy loss. But we could never get to face the gate of the desert without having gradually closed, one by one, all our energy dissipation through the support of discipline. As we have seen, the disempowering spiral is triggered by a thought image generated by the opponent in our surface mind. Thus, before going back to the source, in the meanwhile we can act into our inner selves to reduce at the minimum possible the energy losses caused by the disempowering spiral. To counter this loss, there are two powerful disciplines: the non-expression of negative emotions, the resurfacing of the deep mind. One of the opponent's primary goals is generating negative emotional energy, capable of paralyzing our good intentions, making us prey of any kind of emotional addiction, and transform our lives into a hell totally powered by unreal illusions. However, this outcome may effectively be achieved if and only if this emotional energy is expressed in an action that manifests it. If internally we perceive an emotion of anger and we transform this emotion in action, venting it against something or someone, we have taken the final step in the energy support of the opponent. Because, we could say, the opponent is greedy of the emotional short circuit generated by actions that manifest negative emotions. Do not express negative emotions, and therefore do not transform them into action, means introducing an element of detachment between our perception and the action. The negative emotion continues to exist, but we do not express it, basically because it was generated by a force that we are not, through tools that have been, let's say, usurped from us without us noticing it. But beware, not expressing a negative emotion does not mean denying it or pushing it in deep, because this would introduce an additional element of suffering in our field of consciousness. Not expressing a negative emotion means accepting it totally within us, letting it be everything it has to be, and burning it in the fire of our total attention. Means being totally present in front of it, without any backward step, but without turning it into action. Means observing what we perceive and realizing that our surface mind is interpreting an unpleasant bodily sensation, such as tingling or tightness in certain parts of the body, and is giving it a name associated with a series of actions, or rather reactions, to turn it off or push it back or in deep. Not expressing a negative emotion requires much energy, because normally what we do as unconscious human beings is exactly the opposite. It seems paradoxical, but human beings typically do not exhibit positive emotions and turn into action the negatives. It seems paradoxical, but it is not, because it's a precise tactic result. Yet, emotions are very, very important. All traditions of inner research show us tools aimed to develop and express them at their best. For example, in Kabbalistic language, emotions are called measures, since it is right through them that humans can measure themselves to realize how much they have really progressed on the path of the growth of consciousness. In the normal state, however, human beings come to produce emotions by the misuse of the surface mind for the only benefit of perpetuating the presence of the opponent within their field of consciousness. Do not express negative emotions can and must begin with small steps. There are big demons handled by the opponent within us, and it is crazy beginning the reconquest passing through them. Something simple enters our field of consciousness, shaking our views of the world, and generates a negative emotion: anger, contempt, oppression. Face the emotion that occurs. See how this emotion springs from a thought automatically generated by the surface mind. Look at the nature of this emotion, its taste, the purely physical sensations produced in the body. Look, let the emotion be, but don't manifest it into action. Do not vent the anger or contempt we feel against us or something else. Do not express our depression in actions that confirm it. Observe emotions, but do not express them, because none of all this is us. A negative emotion, intended as an emotion that dissipates energy, which is unbendingly observed, without being fought, without being denied, without being expressed in a reactive manner, passes quickly and starts almost immediately to decrease in intensity. Then, with our inner being so cleaned up, if it will necessary an action to ensure that all of the excitement passes away entirely, we will act, but our action will be clean, creative, and not reactive. All qualities that will make the situation functional and in support of our field of consciousness, rather than a new, umpteenth, and unaware energy supply paid to the opponent. The resurfacing of the deep mind is another discipline of great power, because it acts on a side of the surface mind that the opponent knows and uses to control to its own benefit and with the minimum effort that disempowering spiral, the mechanical interpretation of perceptions. Bringing our attention to the apparently uncontrolled chaos of the surface mind, we will find that almost all the thoughts that we allow ourselves to keep are strangely focused on only one main polarity. Everything that enters our field of consciousness, including ourselves, is judged, that is to say, broken down into separate and disconnected parts, and then labeled guilty of innocent, inappropriate or suitable, unworthy or worthy, possible or not possible, good or bad, etc., etc., by a mechanism that we now know very well. This huge noise prevents us from feeling and accessing within ourselves to a larger amount of information, which includes connective and unifying aspects that are underlying of everything. These aspects cannot be achieved by the surface mind because it has not this function. These aspects are exclusive relevance of the deep mind. Allowing the resurface of the deep mind basically means introducing a wedge of detachment between us and thoughts in the surface mind, because these thoughts are of little importance and they are not who we really are. In this space, created by detachment, we deliberately leave intervening the deep mind through its failings, and instead of accepting fully and immediately thoughts of judgment generated by the surface mind, either positive or negative, we stay in listening, careful and conscious, to the sensations in the deep mind emanating from deepness within us. The chance for the practice of resurfacing of the deep mind is practically our whole existence. Observe a tree, a plant, or an object. Interact with another human being. Detach ourselves by the surface mind and its nonsense that do not belong to us. What do we perceive? Which feeling is the object or being with whom we interact emanating? And the place we are in? What do we really feel? Is there harmony? Or is something wrong? The resurfacing of the deep mind will allow us to almost immediately realize that everything is much, much more than what the surface mind can judge, and that the sum of judgmental and conviction thoughts that we let without rein in us are not even a shadow of that unquestionable reality we believed they were. But the most important element in this conscious resurfacing is the achievement that if the surface mind is interpreting a new perception on the basis of all similar experiences, or is preventing a positive action for our growth with doubts and fears, or is causing an action due to an emotional addiction, thoughts that it uses to dissuade us or to achieve its purposes are not who we are. This is the milestone we have to realize. The fulcrum of our perception is in the deepness of ourselves, in a place where thoughts are not yet become words, but we do never give it the space and silence to manifest itself. Or rather, the opponent does not allow this to happen, because this would lead to see that our life is not in our hands, that is to say, in the deliberate manifestation of the sensations perceived from the deep mind, but in the hands of the opponent's forces, in the inner illusion of our personal freedom. Therefore, the discipline of not expressing negative emotions and the resurfacing of the deep mind create a new inner space, a space of listening and observation. This new space that we will gain with our discipline is a whole space, totally ours, where the opponent cannot survive, nor can intervene to use it to its advantage. The bigger, deeper this space becomes, the more energy we take back by the gravitational field of the opponent, and more majestic and free becomes our existence. The personal, quiet space we have gained through the non-reactive expression of negative emotions and the resurfacing of the deep mind is a space of pure observation in which we are beyond the mechanical and conditioned behavior of the surface mind, and yet we are alert and aware. This space of pure observation is the fertile ground where one of the fundamental faculties of a human being, a legacy that belongs to us as magical being, can finally grow and manifest. The faculty that has been obscured to disempower us and make us an easy prey to the emotional currents induced by the opponent. The faculty that all traditions of inner research stimulate to come back in operation, through a huge number of different ways, everyone leading to the same result. The faculty that brings us back to be what we really are. the faculty of inner silence. Inner silence is the state of being in which any attempt of identification triggered by the opponent literally disappears because it is reabsorbed by the fire of attention. It is a state of extreme vigilance and awareness that springs from the absence of thoughts in the shape of consequential and associative words and images. It's a state in which the surface mind is in fact disconnected from the pure perception of our own existence, of our own being as a field of energy and consciousness. A state in which the surface mind does not determine and set the I am of a human being, because it is the I am who contains the surface mind, and not vice versa. In the state of inner silence, any attempt to trigger a disempowering spiral by the opponent is instantly recognized and let go, because the beginning of something that is not ours and we do not want is immediately recognized in it. This is what the inner silence can do for us in our reconquest, but that's not all. We can say that there is no limit to what we can achieve, express, and explore, increasingly deepening and strengthening this own forgotten faculty. The inner silence cannot be explained in words. It is very needed to act and work to understand it at all levels of our being, to realize its extreme importance in our lives. But luckily, on this path, all traditions of inner research support us, teaching a large number of procedures and disciplines to achieve it and root it, and we do only need to find and experiment the practices that mostly vibrate with our uniqueness. For example, all the disciplines brought together with the term meditation, they share, even in the wide variety of techniques that make them different, the same goal: to feed and raise in us the expansion of a perceptive space of inner silence. This is one of their main goals, in infinite ways, just one direction. This expansion of inner silence in us will lead, among innumerable benefits, the exponential expansion of our perception faculties as a result of the expansion of consciousness that is inextricably linked to the inner silence, and will be this amplified perception, this enhanced consciousness that will inactivate more and more strongly the actions of the opponent's forces. in a human being, the more energy is available to the consciousness, the less energy is available to the opponent's forces. There is nothing more powerful in this energetic reconfiguration than the practice of inner silence. But how can we make space for the inner silence in our lives? Inner silence is a discipline that can be potentially practiced, and finally will be, seamlessly throughout our entire existence. How? Delivering our total attention about what is happening right now, redirecting as much as possible and as long as possible the attention we give our thoughts of the surface mind to the perceptions of the present moment gathered by our senses. For this practice is required nothing more than our life. At any time, let us remember to bring our attention within the confines of the present instant, detaching it from the surface mind. At any time and for any action we are doing, remember to be alive, present. Remember yourself as Gurdjieff, inner researcher of the last century, called this discipline. Give our whole attention to the action we are doing. Meanwhile, collect information about ourselves and the environment with our senses. What is our posture? How are we breathing? Are we acting quietly, or are we feeling an inward discontent? What about the body and the place we are in? It is no coincidence that the discipline of resurfacing of the deep mind has similar aspects to the practice of inner silence. In fact, it's starting from the inner silence that the deep mind decodes in perception the reality coming in contact with our field of consciousness. This razor's edge of the present moment creates a dam that is literally inaccessible to the opponent. As long as we remain in this state, the opponent cannot drag us with it, because to do so, it needs that we believe in what he says. It needs that we fall back to the energy level of listening and automatic identification with the surface mind, with a consequent generation of emotional energy. This is one of the reasons why the inner silence is so important. When we are immersed in it, the opponent ceases to control our existence, and consequently we gain a free space for the perception of those inner sources that are what we really are, which are expression of our lives and what we really want. Finally, we release in us the space to be who we really are. We need a great deal of energy at the beginning to continuously support this new state of being. Therefore, we must not lose patience if we can, just for a few seconds, but we must not desist from trying. After all, since many years we are used to act exactly the opposite, living free rein and giving our full attention to that uninterrupted chain of useless, senseless, and noisy associative thoughts with whom we identify, that bring us here and there to make actions that often we do not even want to do, just to quell the negative emotions that we perceive. Accompanying this practice, we can then decide to explore and select in the range of disciplines offered by all traditions of inner research, those directed to the expansion of inner silence that more vibrate in agreement with who we are and our preferences, and then turn them into a daily discipline. Achieving inner silence is not the prerogative of a practice rather than another, but it is only a prerogative of the unbending intent of those who want to achieve it. For this reason, there is no discipline better or worse than other on this path. What for me can be an effective way to explore the inner silence, for another human being can be really useless. It is responsibility of the individual human being to select the more congenial means to achieve the inner silence. But one of the wonderful consequences of our practice is that the consciousness itself, expanded by the inner silence, will suggest us, often by means that are completely similar to those used by the opponent, what discipline is right to try for rooting the inner silence even further. One day, we might be surprised to consider the possibility of studying in deep the Zen meditation. Or we will be driven to find in our area a yoga class. Or we will be driven suddenly to practice Tai Chi Chuan, or to learn playing a specific musical instrument at our best. Where did these sudden openings come from? From the space we have opened through the inner silence, from the space that through the inner silence connects us to the vastness of the infinite and to anything else in our wonderful universe. Inner silence is the gate of the infinite. There is no more effective tool than that, in the way that brings us to the wonderful life that we wish to live and we have the right to live, especially if we join the endless inspirations it suggests us with action. Expanding the inner silence means progressively inactivate all the automatic instincts of the opponent, up to convert the opponent itself in a set of forces allied to our intent of manifesting a wonderful life. Expanding the inner silence means living fully our destiny of magical human beings in a wonderful universe. Either you let the reins of our life in the hands of the opponent, or you strive to awaken the magic, the strength, the power, the consciousness that are in you and are your legacy and your right as human being, without any distinction. This choice is in every single breath we inhale, in every single thought we nourish, in every single word we say, in every single action we do. The aim of our existence is to choose at any time one of these two paths, one of these two possibilities. A choice of each instant, each second, each moment in which escape is impossible. Discipline, non-reactive expression of negative emotions, resurfacing of the deep mind, inner silence. The four phases of the pyramid of reconquest, tools that act in parallel, supporting and nurturing one another towards the top, towards the acme. The journey may not be short. It may take years to build a solid, steady structure. In our life, there are a lot of thought-emotional structures completely managed by the opponent for its purposes, and some of them are so rooted within us, so closely linked to our identifications, that it can take years of work before being inactivated. These structures are nothing more than our beliefs, our convictions, those dogma on which we found our lives, those mental inherited laws on which we conform our actions, those activities that we believe to be an inalienable part of our being. All things that death will sweep away like dry leaves. In our years of work, it is certain that we will fall, over and over again, into various emotional addictions that we carry inside. It's rare to be able to immediately stop the emotional flood that for so many years leads us to become an emotion, to satisfy a hypothetical, irrepressible need. But our pyramid of reconquest that we're building is acting, and it is certain too, in spite of our lost battles. By continuing to practice, to build, to replace, one day the attack of the opponent will be simply rejected in the beginning, up to disappear. We will recognize with irony and tranquility the unreal structure to which we gave our consent to keep itself, and we will let it go as quick as a click of the fingers. What are we talking about? Of all those thoughts, emotional structures in our lives that have bred emotional attachment to their satisfaction. Smoke, alcohol, sex, food, work, shopping, even the shopping. Should we deny it? Not on your life. Forced deprivation is harmful and pointless. We have to transcend them. We have to disconnect them from the control of the opponent through detachment and light them under the fire of consciousness. What remains? Ourselves. The freedom and joy of being, rather than the slavery of depending, disguised as personal freedom. In building the life in which we really belong, it's good to treasure some tips related to the experience of those that before us began and continued the same process. Here are a few. It's very important not to allow the rise and growth of anger following a non-reactive expression of negative emotions. Anger is a negative emotion itself, highly damaging to the balance of energy in a field of human consciousness, and has no sensible reason to exist. It is merely a reaction of the opponent to the resistance or failed identification of the field of human consciousness with the disempowering spiral it triggered. Develop and nurture as much as possible within ourselves the perception of the subtle balance between restrain oneself and repress oneself. Restrain oneself means accepting the negative emotion, relentlessly observing it in ourselves, understanding if it should be expressed or let go, and then be ready to a possible expression at the right time and never in a violent or agitated way. Repress oneself means not to accept the emotion, thus drawing it with rage within us, feeding the cauldron of the opponent. In our process of reconquest, not expressing negative emotions through repression or letting repression generate and nourish anger is futile, unnecessary, and harmful. But what if the rage or negative emotion in us has had time to grow and manifest without us being able to stop it? When the opponent triggers a disempowering spiral, a field of human consciousness in inner silence is able to recognize instantly within itself the appearance of a thought image that is not the result of its conscious intention. Therefore, can stop the process as it arises simply by refusing to feed it, that is, consciously replacing it with a thought image tied to experiences that we want to live. But if within us the interrelated emotion has already been triggered, it means that the disempowering spiral was charged with energy. At that point, resistance is much more difficult and can easily lead to anger. That is an effect that, as we have seen, does nothing but further amplify the whole pattern. So what to do? A good practice is to wrap in the inner silence the action we take as a result of the emotional addiction. That is, become extremely aware and therefore observe without judging and with our full attention what we are doing, or rather, what we are somehow compelled to do. Experience the action in total consciousness. Look at the effects on our body, our emotions that follow, the effects on the environment around us. We will discover many things. We will discover, for example, that we cannot interrupt what we are doing, even if we perceive the damage we are causing. Yet, for some mechanical ideas managed by the opponent, a single action amplified by consciousness like this is sufficient to expose and transcend them instantly and permanently. In our observation, wrapped in the inner silence, the deep mind will make emerge and show to us, with clarity and sweetness that are its peculiar characteristics, a very simple question that could shake ourselves up to foundations. This sudden flash of understanding is sometimes enough to change the course of a whole lifetime. Now, it's up to you. It's up to you to decide to accept the challenge or not. It's up to you to decide whether to live a whole life at the mercy of the opponent and its addictions, or live the intense, proud, strong, free, happy life of a field of consciousness and energy that is broken free. My last gift to you here is a story. Listen and return into it whenever you will feel that your faith wavers. I awoke to the sound of the clock ticking loudly on the blue drawer. I was 6. And it was my birthday. I let my pyjamas fall to the ground and I threw them under the bed, then ran down the stairs wearing only my Lone Ranger underpants. It was my birthday. Within a few hours, my friends would be arriving with gifts, and there would be cake, ice cream, and lots of fun. After all the party decorations were detached and everyone had gone, I played listlessly with my new toys. I was bored, tired, and my stomach hurt. I closed my eyes and I fell asleep. I saw each day pass like the next. School for a week, then weekend, school, weekend, summer, autumn, winter, and spring. The years passed, and before long, I was one of the best gymnasts in Los Angeles high schools. In the gym, life was exciting. Outside of it, a general disappointment. One day, Coach Harold Frey called me from Berkeley University, California, offered me a scholarship to the university. I could not wait to go to the coast for a new life. I argued with my girlfriend for this, and in the end we broke up. I felt bad, but I consoled myself with my university projects. Soon I was sure life was really going to begin. The college years flew, reaching gymnastic wins. I married my new girlfriend, Susie. I was so busy with training that I didn't have much time and energy for my new wife. In the end, I participated in the Olympics, but my performances were not equal to my expectations. I returned home and slipped into relative anonymity. My daughter was born, and I started feeling pressure and responsibility that grew. I found a job, life insurance salesman, but it took up most of my days and nights. I had no time for my family. Within a year, Susie and I were separated. In the end, she obtained a divorce. A fresh start, I reflected sadly. One day, I looked in the mirror and realized that 40 years had passed since my Olympics. Where had my life gone? With the help of the psychiatrist, I had overcome my drinking problem, and I'd had money, houses, and women. But I had no one now. I was lonely. I lay in bed, it was night, and wondered where my daughter was. It had passed years since I'd seen her. I wondered about Susie and my friends of my good old days. Now, I spend my days sitting in my favorite rocking chair, sipping wine, watching TV, and thinking about the old days. I watched children play in front of my house. I had been a good life, I supposed. I'd gotten everything I'd gone after. So why wasn't I happy? I sat alone. I had been alone my whole life, it seemed. I lay back on my rocking chair and breathed, and then I cried soundlessly and bitterly. God damn it! Why did my marriage have to fail? How could I have done things differently? How could I really have lived? Suddenly, I felt a terrible, nagging fear, the worst of my life. Was it possible that I had missed something very important, something transcendental, something that would have made a real difference? No, impossible, I assured myself. I cited all my achievements aloud, but the fear persisted. I stood up slowly, looked down at the town from the porch of my hilltop house, and wondered, where had life gone? What was it for? My knuckles grew white as I clutched the railing, trembling. Then my body turned to ice and my heart to stone. I fell back into the chair, my head dropped forward. There were lights I'd never seen before and sounds I'd never heard. Visions floated by. In the end, all sight and sound became a point of light, then vanished. I had found the only peace I'd ever known. There are innumerable possible futures. Accept the challenge, traveler. Dismantle the opponent out of your life. Dismantle the opponent out of your life. I wish you all the possible best, traveler.